Hello and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Sealey from GlobalNet21, and this is one of our Tuesday night webinars where we often get presenters on to talk about a topic that they're interested in, they've got a passion on, and which our members and people in other networks are also interested in. And over the last few months and for the next few months, we're doing quite a lot on democracy. We've done several meetings in Conway Hall, in the House of Commons, and we've done a few webinars as well, looking at sortition and citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies and digital democracy, direct democracy, and so on. What we haven't looked at, and which is a really interesting and innovative experiment, is Flatpack Democracy. Now, you may wonder what Flatpack Democracy is, and I did for some time, until I looked at the experiments that were going on in Frome, or From, as they call it, in Somerset.
Thank you.
We've got Peter with us here today, who is the sort of initiator behind the Flatpack Democracy experiment, and he's going to talk about that in a minute. We've then got Patrick, who has been on before and has done webinars with us before, and he's done a lot of work on citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, and so on. And he's going to update us on some of the things on that. And Terry is here, who's going to help us with the questions when they both finish their presentations. Peter, thank you for joining us today and telling us about the experiment you've done in Frome and you know, how it challenged the party system and attempted to engage citizens in a more direct and continuous way, getting away from those bodies that get in the way, such as parties. So I'm going to hand over to you to do your presentation.
Thanks. Funnily enough, I feel almost more nervous in sitting opposite a computer in the attic, in my attic in Frome, than I do normally. And I've got a few notes, which means I will look down sometimes, I'm afraid. I wanted to say a couple of things, Francis, about democracy, or my take on democracy, just before I started, in a way. Which is that because it kind of frames how I've come to this 10 years ago, and that's that I'm increasingly convinced that we don't live in a democracy, and that there's a pretense of democracy going on, really because, in my view, politics has been hijacked by party politicians. And that's a kind of background to what I want to say and to how I got involved with a group of other completely party politicians and people who hadn't been involved in party politics before in Frome. And the other little bit I wanted to say around that is that I think that representative democracy, as it's so called, or a representative way of doing things, is now really, really so out of date that we shouldn't really be engaged with it at all. That we have to move much more to participatory democracy and a much broader engagement of the people. And that's because many years ago, it might have worked for Lord Bath to set off on his horse and go to London and come back 4 years later and speak to the people. But now people are so much more in touch than they were, that there's a constant exchange that is possible. The people who are elected cannot possibly know everything in very complicated situations. And also, we increasingly realize that people being involved in making decisions about their lives is really important for their own well-being. So for those reasons, I think participatory democracy is really important. And that's been crucial in my getting involved in all of this. So the story that you asked for, having done that little prelude, is that I live in Frome, which is a market town in southwest of England, for those who don't know, a bit south of Bath. With about 27,000 people. And what we had in 2010 when I came to this was something which was absolutely clearly not working for Frome. It was very unambitious. It had a group of half Tories and half Lib Dems. Wouldn't really matter what they were in my view, but it had a fairly equal split of people elected for their political backgrounds or baggage. And they spent most of their time fighting with each other. And doing very little for Frome. And as I kind of implied before, they got elected and then they disappeared for 4 years and then they turned up again. Actually, interestingly, I was at a meeting last night where I saw one of the remaining politicians in the area, for the first time in 3 years. So it tells me there must be an election next year, which there is. So, in that kind of way, it's something which wasn't working for us. And the group that came together knew about localism. Localism was the invention of that dear man, David Cameron, who said, we must take the power from the political elite and give it to the man and woman in the street, which sounds very unlikely, but he really did say it. And what he was doing was trying to push power down the system. For us here, we've got a district and a county above us. So there's tiers of government above us. And what we knew was that central government, as austerity took hold, was going to stop putting funds into those layers. So we as Frome were going to get less and less. So we thought, hey, localism, we're going to get power. And B, if we don't do it, no one else is going to. And C, if you like, we've got a really dysfunctional and, well, not, yeah, I mean, a very unambitious and not doing much council. Let's have fun and give this a poke. And so we met in a number of pubs. Very shortly afterwards, had 17 candidates for 17 seats. And in that 2010 election, won 10 of those seats. So suddenly 10 of us, who, as I say, had never done politics at all, found ourselves effectively running Frome. And one of the things that we'd realized right from the beginning is that as a group, we needed to do two things. One is we needed to have a set of rules, which we called our ways of working, or really a sort of set of core principles and values, which would hold us together and bind us together in terms of the way that we operated together as a group. And secondly, we said that we must, what we would do is exactly what I said before. We would do participative democracy, not representative. We wouldn't say we knew everything. We would go out to the town. So as soon as we got elected, right at the very first meeting, we suspended the standing orders, which are the rules of the council. Got rid of the 9 committees that there were, introduced 2, massively simplified the system, and made it very, very informal. And so that now, some years later, if you came to one of our meetings, it's like a bunch of people in a pub. I mean, it's a bunch of people in a room, some of whom are councillors. When there needs to be a vote, you know, we'll put our voting card up, which has your name on it. So you know who's voting, but you wouldn't necessarily know otherwise. And I'll probably be wearing the same as I'm wearing now. There isn't a row of men in suits and the public who can't speak. So we've broken down a lot of the formality, and that's been a crucial part of what we're doing, because that for me is a crucial part of getting people to participate more. And then right from the beginning, we greatly increased the number of, the amount of money going to the community, generally to community organizations by 10 times. So in that first budget, we multiplied it by 10. We then employed 2 staff to work with the community and someone to full-time support with fundraising for groups. So a huge strengthening of the voluntary sector right from that early stage. And then we tried to imbibe in the staff, and I suppose in councillors as well, an instinctive answer of yes, not no. So tried to encourage risk, tried to say, you know, let's try and see what happens. And with that came a whole new raft of staff, many of whom are really, really excellent. Well, all of whom are really excellent, but they're not the sort of people who would normally work for councils. So very adventurous and you know, much more up for it, which has been brilliant. So for 4 years, we did a lot of stuff, which I haven't got time to talk about. We can pick up on some of it later. And then stood again in 2015. And at that point, there were 30 people who wanted to stand for independence for Frome. And to my amazement, there were nearly 50 who stood against us. So all of the parties stood against us. Now, just to give you, you know, a bit of background, I think it's 68% of town council elections, there are no elections. I mean, there aren't enough people to stand. So in 2/3 of towns, there aren't any elections. We had 40 people standing against us, which is some measure of the interest that we'd created in democracy in Frome. And then that kind of spread through Flatpack, which is the title of a book. It's not really a movement. I wrote this. I was encouraged to write this. Oh, that's inside out on my screen. Anyway, I was encouraged to write this by a publisher who said, this is an interesting story. I thought, well, we might sell a few. He thought we might sell a few. We've sold about 4,500. And then that's led to around 100 other towns who are engaged in some way or other. I mean, have elected people. and around a dozen who are now run, I mean, where groups of independents are in power in the same way. And there's other strange and unexpected ones, a couple in Belgium who are flatpack parties, and a whole connection with Denmark, which has now gone on because there's an alternative party there, which has very similar sort of approach to politics that we do. So Flatpack has led me personally into all sorts of new areas, and it's also led a lot of people to Frome and film crews and interest and so on. Because of that thing really of us working together as a bunch of independents. And I think the other thing is massively upping the ambition, because that which links into austerity, which I mentioned before, that previously, in a way, it didn't matter if town councils were very unambitious, just did, the mayor wore the chain, you did things like twinning, and nice things. It wasn't the end of the world because most of the services came down from above. Now they don't. And that's really started hitting us. And in our second term, that's really started clocking in. So we have no money for youth, for the arts, for any of the things like that, for mental health. So we've now taken on a lot of those. Now, more to some extent, more by luck than judgment. When I say we, what's taken those on has been the community. So we've developed a whole range of other ways of supporting the community and pushing power out. We've used large groups of people in what we call panels, which was an idea stolen from Podemos in Spain, large groups of people to help us with strategy, but it's also to bring in expertise. So on things like sports, the arts, we've brought in lots more people and basically said to them, we'll have 3 meetings, they'll be very well defined, very well facilitated. You tell us what our strategy should be and we'll do it. Now, legally, we don't have to do it, but of course we have, because otherwise it would undermine the situation. So that again is greatly increased participation in a very meaningful way. And kind of similarly, we've created some really strong partnerships. There were 2 which immediately spring to mind. One, an organization which is now set up called Fair Frome, which works on all issues to do with poverty, particularly the food bank. We have something called a community fridge, those sorts of issues. And then there's another one called Fair Housing, which is looking at all issues around accommodation and housing. Now, in those cases, we've catalyzed that, or a conversation with the community has catalyzed those organizations. We've helped set them up with small amounts of money, but they're now totally separate. They're charities in their own right. So they can fundraise, they can bring in their own directors and trustees, they can bring in their own volunteers. Again, it's all about trying to pull in larger areas, larger groups of expertise. And Fair Housing got a grant of, I think it was 60,000 quid from a trust outside Frome the other day. And Fair Frome probably gets 5 or 6 times the money that we give them as a council. So it's a way of bringing money in when it's not coming in any other way. And then that, and this is really the final thing I want to say in many ways, what that has done is it's created a sort of ecology, an environment of around 400 organizations, which have now been linked to the health center. So the health center is running a project, and has done for the last 3 years, by which people who come with a whole range of issues to the health center can be prescribed community activity. And then there are 4 staff and 500 volunteers who help coax those people in the right direction and hold their hand. And that work's been very well written up. It was written up recently in The Guardian and in Resurgence. And that work has led to a 17% reduction in hospital readmissions in Frome, compared to a 30% increase in Somerset as a whole. So nearly a 50% difference between Somerset and Frome in terms of people who are, particularly elderly people, who are going into hospital and then coming back out, because many, it was a quick circle. They came back into the community and they weren't ready to be there. But by trying to build a community that's much more joined up and is better functioning, Frome's really able to make that work well. And we're looking to extend that into other areas. I mean, those are the kinds of things that have really, I guess, attracted attention to Frome recently. And I would say that they're built on people reclaiming politics So that for me, what those groups are all doing is politics, and what we're not doing in Frome is party politics, and that's what has made this interesting to others. And I think that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was really interesting, and it'll give a lot of people some thought. So please type your questions in, and after Patrick, we'll come back to Peter and we'll put those questions to him. And yeah, Patrick, you've also been doing a lot of experiments in participatory democracy, not only in the area of citizen juries and assemblies, but you've been making some films around that as well, which have been very interesting. So do you want to update us about the work that you're doing as well? Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Francis, and thanks, Peter, as well, for your talk, because I always love hearing what you've got to say and hearing it in its totality as well, because it's certainly an inspiring story. So my main activity is that of journalism, and the nature of journalism in 2018 is that it is a sort of exercise in improvisation, I think. It's very difficult to be a full-time journalist and actually make a living, which is its particular challenge, but it's not necessarily a problem, because I think in the act of improvisation is innovation, and that's a healthy process. And it means that when I listen to Peter talk about political innovation, it certainly speaks to me as a journalist. And so I suppose my time here is to make the link between Flatpack Democracy and what I'm working on principally, which is a series of short documentaries, so sort of under 20 minutes, which will be an examination of where we've got to with electoral democracy. So what many people are saying is a crisis in electoral democracy. Not to spend too much time there, and get on to the stories like Peter's, which are the, as it were, hacks to the system. So I think it's pretty easy nowadays, 2018, to say that we have huge problems with electoral democracy, and there is something that we need to do, or maybe many things that we need to do, to make our politics function a great deal better. So where does that leave me as a journalist? So it leaves me in the place which is, where do we start? If we're going to unpick the problem that is the crisis in democracy, how do we go about doing that? And for me, that has been the question of really semantics even, which is, what does it mean? What does the word democracy mean? And I know that that's something that I think probably as a society in the UK, but even globally, you could say we've been a bit glib. We've talked about democracy as a good thing, and it involves elections and a few freedoms, but we've never really taken it much deeper. We've taken it for granted, and I think probably in the last 30 years, certainly in Western countries, we've been a bit lazy and sort of got on with our lives and let democracy do its thing, and not done much to either examine it with curiosity ourselves, let alone work out why it's not working or try and do something about it. So with Peter and Frome, you've got some people who are disgruntled and did something about it, and you can see real, specific, tangible improvements in the quality of life of people in Frome as a result of that, which is very inspiring. So where do I come into that? It's that the Frome story is definitely one of the stories that I'll be looking at. But funnily enough, in the editorial logic of what I'm looking at, it is towards the end, because what Frome represents for me is a hack to the system. Frome is what you would do if you want to subvert the electoral process. So rather than being Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat in a UK context, you're saying we are no party. We want to act locally. We want to act transparently and take things from the grassroots in real terms, not just some sort of fuzzy concept of a charity, but actually, you people of Frome, what do you want? And it's a spectacular success, and it's no surprise that people are beating a door to the independence of Frome and to Peter there. So what does it mean specifically? So me as a journalist sort of trying to work this out, it is a break from party politics. It has allowed fresh thinking, which is not governed by any particular level of what you have, which is the party line in local politics. It's obviously the party whip when you get to Westminster. So individuals are free to behave as individuals and be inspired and creative and not in fear of party discipline for saying the wrong thing. So you don't have gaffes when you have no party. And so the antidote to elections that is an example like Frome is that you don't just turn up a few weeks before the election, say, vote for me, and also don't vote for that person. And if you win, take power and disappear for a few years before it's time to win the elections again. The way that Frome has worked is to stay engaged over the electoral cycle, which is a big difference from conventional politics. So you have on the one hand, elections, conventional elections, we vote, they disappear, and then they come back when they want us again, or you have an engagement over the course of the cycle. So that opens, as Peter was explaining, the door for local innovation. I don't personally believe that people are politically apathetic. I think it makes a lot of sense for me that turnout rates in elections are low. It's because people think, and I know because I talk to them, and I also am obviously a potential voter myself, what's the point? You know, if you've got one party which is pretty much the same as the other party, even if they sound different, but fundamentally do the same sorts of things, a good example being New Labour and the Conservatives, you know, why choose one versus the other when they both give you austerity for the thing? So the good thing about an approach like Flatpack is that you get engagement with people who feel they are listened to, and what they talk about then gets done. How does this apply to what I'm doing in All Hands On, which is the name of the documentary series? I'm looking for innovations the world over, because electoral democracy is a global story. It's not just Frome. For all the delights of Frome and the west of England, the Spanish are having a bit of trouble with electoral democracy at the moment. The Germans took months to have a government. The Belgians before them, the Dutch before them. The United States president, whose name I don't need to mention, is the result of electoral politics. Theresa May has a wafer-thin margin, but it still gives her power for 5 years by virtue of a fairly dodgy deal with a fairly dodgy party in Northern Ireland. So this is democracy in crisis. That's the first episode, which is elections versus other forms of choosing our political devices. And what I've done already with the film, which is actually out there, called When Citizens Assemble, is moving into the solutions phase. The Irish have done this extraordinary thing, which is to randomly select their citizens, so no elections there, which means that Irish people of all shape or form representing Ireland have been drawn together. They just finished their work on several subjects. The one I filmed was to do with reproductive health rights for women, so obviously most controversially, abortion. The Irish will vote next month, and I can't say for certain, but I would be prepared to put money as a Scotsman on the likelihood of them voting in favour of a radical liberalisation of abortion law in Ireland, which is frankly stunning. And 2 or 3 years ago, there's no one amongst the conventional commentators who would have anticipated that happening. And why did it happen? A huge part of the impetus is the Citizens' Assembly. You gather together all sides of the argument, they get a chance to speak, they get a chance to listen, and they get a chance to listen to experts on the subject, and then deepen their collective understanding together, and then produce some conclusions and recommendations which go to the whole Irish people. And effectively, that's what they're going to vote on next month. And so instead of having what was conflictual politics, one side versus the other, what you had as politicians worried about losing their seats. If I mention abortion, then I will not get re-elected. You had this deadlocked political process in Ireland. You get something which is take the politics out of it. Let's actually talk about the real issues. and then make some recommendations. And now the Irish are looking at a breaking of the deadlock. So that's at the national level. If you take the electoral politics out of policy issues at the local level, that's possible. The national level, as we've seen with the Irish. Imagine, for example, the United Kingdom had had a citizens' assembly on Brexit before we had Brexit, before we had the vote on Brexit. You would not have dodgy facts on both sides and a very confused electorate trying to decide what on earth to do on a spectacularly important subject for the United Kingdom and, in fact, for the rest of the European Union. What it boils down to is a series of films on solutions based around random selection and deliberation, seeding the conversation so that people actually even have this conversation. What is democracy? What is random selection? How does that relate to original definitions versus what we have today? And sharing the materials, provoking discussions, and also showing examples from all over the world. And, you know, even conversations tonight, like tonight. So the last element is, I mean, this is in the UK, so these conversations are taking place around screenings. We have one in London next week on the 23rd, and the idea is to bring people together to experience politics, taking part rather than watching people sort of verbally punch each other.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Patrick.
Right.
So you've told us about what you're doing and what's happening on the 23rd. And if you let me have information about that, I'll make sure it goes round to everyone on our social networks. Okay, so let's start with the questions. I mean, let me start first of all. I mean, clearly, Peter, you are trying to replace representative democracy by direct democracy or by participatory democracy. But you're doing it through a representative system. So there's a great danger, isn't there, of someone saying, here is a Flatpack party come along. It's a new party that's emerged. They're talking about participatory democracy, but they're doing it through the representative system, and they're choosing independents who are basically Flatpackers. So you face the same problem, don't you, as the other parties do?
That's what, of course, has been said to us. I mean, and was said. I mean, it was said at that initial election that this, you know, we're actually a secret party of Marxists with all sorts of, far left and anarchic views, and vote for us, and you don't know what we're going to say. And that is the challenge in rolling this out, because what one needs to sell to people is a different way of doing things. And so what we needed to persuade people was that this was a group that actually contained a complete representation. And I think, well, history has shown, or, you know, Frome has shown, and then other towns, that you can do that in a relatively small place. So many of us were known, you know, so in a sense, I was standing on the doorstep saying, vote for me, you know, because I had a history within the town, a history of being involved as a governor of the school and of being involved in the transition town movement and so on. And then others of us, or many of us, came from community organizations. So we were already known in that kind of a way. So, you know, yes, exactly, that's what it was put to us, if you like. It's absolutely not the case. We're not a party. There are 17 independents now who have very different views from far right to far left, politically, and have robust debate in a way which, if we were all of one political party, if we were all whatever, Green or Labour, or, you know, I would be much more worried, because we'd all come with a very narrow manifesto. We have a complete range, and I think that works better at this level, and so do the people of Frome.
Okay, Terry?
We have a question from Pete Burden, and Pete lives in Lewes in Sussex. And his question is about the different levels or layers of local government. He says that in Lewes there are 3 councils: the town council, the district council, and the county council. And Pete wonders, Peter, if you have the same situation in Frome, and if so, how do you interact with these councils at the other levels of local government?
Sure. We do have exactly that same setup here. Many councils across Britain don't. They have they miss out that middle level. So many have the towns, and then they have just the county. But we, like Lewes, also have the district. So we have 3 levels. I guess I mean, sometimes if people ask me what's our biggest mistake, I would say that it was probably in going to war with the next level up. The next level up, the district, and it will be the same in Lewis, has the power, has powers around planning. And we only went to war with them. We tried being nice, and we tried being friendly, and we tried everything else. And essentially, they were incredibly slow and tedious, and really, really didn't like us because we're not Tory, because they were clearly doing party politics and we weren't. They didn't understand what we were about and weren't prepared to wait, and certainly weren't prepared to wait and go, whoa, this is really good for Frome, which is the biggest town in the district. And so, you know, we got uppity about that, which they really didn't like. And so then they put everything that was Frome on the bottom of the pile. You know, that's very clear, which meant that after a while we began to suffer as a town, because planning things particularly were just sat there. And there are other things, you know, there are 6 toilets around, old toilets around Frome, which belong to that level, to the district level, which have been closed for years, for sort of 8 or 10 years, and are just vandalized. They do nothing about them and have done nothing about them, and our trying to get anything done is just rebuffed. That sort of thing means that we changed to having what's now a sort of pragmatic and working relationship. And I believe it's the same in Lewis in terms of the relationship, and it certainly is all over the country. I think a lot of people would like to see that middle district level go now, because it really serves no useful purpose. The relationship with the counties are very different, because they do the big stuff. They do the roads and hospitals, where they still do, you know, they're doing the big infrastructural stuff. So we don't have as much to do with them in some ways, and we don't need to. But we should really have a better relationship than we do with the district. Sorry, that's a long answer, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's a good answer. But, you know, one of the things you said in your presentation is you think that what you do works on the small level that you're at. And so the question that Peter or Pete gave about interacting with the district and the county council is a very real one, because you asked, can you get Flatpackery to work on the county council with huge budgets and big committees? And Kevin raises a really interesting point. He says, look, I come from Northamptonshire, which is a county council in disarray at the moment. I mean, wouldn't it be possible to have a series of an association, a confederation of flat-packing town councils? He doesn't say flat-packing, but of town councils that work together rather than a top-down structure. Is that a radical idea that he's proposing? And does that solve the problem of size versus smallness?
I think it could. If they and it came up, something slightly similar came up. Well, it has parallels. We had a conference for about 100 people in Frome this week from councils at a town level. So 50 or so councils came to Frome to discuss different ideas. And for many of them who, like us, the austerity is really bitten and there are no resources there, what they're starting to do is to look at working together. And then the question which came up is, well, aren't you recreating a district, or aren't you creating a sort of a parallel district, one that actually works? To which the answer was, yeah, in a way we are. If we all came together to refund a police presence, or some things like, you know, just paying for the community's CAB, the Citizen Advice Bureau, things like that. So doing things together. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see that happen in Northamptonshire. Of course, the problem is that they won't have any real power. And if the county aren't on board with this idea, you know, if the county want to squash it, if they're being given this new structure is being the unitary authorities, they could simply remove. I suppose they wouldn't give any resources, and so they could quite quickly squash it. It depends. It'd be great to see that happen, because they're clearly, Northamptonshire's is quite notorious now, and it's collapsed, but it's not alone in collapsing or being near to collapse.
Peter, you answered the question from Pete in Lewis, and he just comes back. He wants to know if you did in fact win your battle with the district council.
No, not really. No, I mean, in many ways, I mean, as I say, I think now we have a sort of we have a pragmatic relationship which kind of works, where we sort of ignore each other. There are some specific projects now, though, where the workers have been allowed to work, if you see what I mean. So the politicians at a district level have kind of said, well, okay, fine, you know, let's not be quite as draconian as we were in our hatred. Let's so there are good connections at a staff level, and so there's some nice projects going on. So I don't know whether that's winning or not. I've still got my pitchfork in the garage ready for action.
I can tell you come from Somerset.
I do.
So do I. I have my pitchfork too. Patrick, I mean, you actually put a link up to a Swiss example, which I think you're trying to show that you can have participation without creating parties. Is that what you're trying to show?
Yes, that is precisely what I was sort of raising up. That Swiss example is sort of self-explanatory. It hasn't got a follow-up blog post on that site, Equality by Lot, saying what happened after the elections. But the promise by the candidates was vote for us, and then we are going to institute various different forms of random selection and deliberation rather than take up our positions in power. And I think the reality with what you've got with Frome, and then now, I mean, it's extraordinary that there were 50 town councils at the event just the other day. There is a massive appetite for this level of engagement, and these are early days. That's the reality. Peter and his mates there are pioneers, and I use that word advisedly, because that really is what they're doing. And obviously people will, as they take away the Flatpack Democracy, they'll probably do what you wouldn't do with an IKEA flat pack, which is that they're going to improvise it and build it some way other than on the instructions. But in fact, if you read Peter's instructions, it's precisely that. It's do your own thing in your own circumstances in the way that suits you locally. So these are early days, and Peter and his colleagues have had to sort of face the rocks chucked at them, which are normal responses of people being skeptical. And in fact, it's healthy even. And the fact that they have given coherent and convincing answers is what's allowing the momentum to build around these sort of experiments. It's also great that it's taking place at a level of power which is not, tearing down the palace, as it were. These are little things at a local level, but the wonderful thing is that it's engaging people back in politics. It's giving them confidence in the fact that they can do this stuff, and it's also quite good fun. Rather than being disaffected and disempowered, it's actually, oh, come on, let's get on with something and do it.
Okay, Terry.
We have a question from Phil about Frome. And he says it's about funding. He says, other than catalysing standalone charitable organisations to provide services, do you have the ability to raise funds directly in Frome? He says he assumes not, but would the town trust you to do that and to spend it wisely if you were able to?
Frome has been experimenting not directly with participatory budgets, which are another way of bringing your public into the process of assessing a financial need, in terms of priorities, where does the money come from, and then where does the money get allocated to. They haven't directly done a formal participatory budget, but they've had participatory budget elements within the council process. So it is an experiment, and they have been experimenting with that. So it does allow some sort of financial autonomy, even at their level, with the trust of the citizens.
Let me ask you one question about what Peter said, Patrick, because it does relate to something that you do, I think. Peter said that in Frome they create panels to deal with particular areas, and they've set up partnerships like Fairer Frome and Fairer Housing. And those panels, in a way, are a bit like your citizen jury idea, aren't they? They're there to actually make this sort of decisions in a participatory way. Are the setting up of panels in Frome, do you think, going down the lines that you've been advocating for some time, Patrick?
I suppose what my concern would be, and it's a small c concern, is that the sort of people that will come forward for panels are the sort of people who are sort of one way or other sort of politically awake and sort of prepared to get involved with stuff. And I don't mean that as a good or a bad thing. If you are a someone who's struggling for work, struggling for accommodation. If life is tough for you, then you're not going to have time to be on a panel, even if you have knowledge and expertise and perspectives that would be very valuable to that panel. So what I suspect, which may be wrong with regard to the panels of Frome, is that they still have issues of being underrepresentative of the community of Frome. And that's where random selection is really interesting. And in fact, random selection with some form of reward for those chosen, because not everyone can afford to give time. You know, if randomly selected, okay, come forward. Maybe I can't afford to go. But if you give some sort of financial reward, it doesn't need to be massive, but so to lay off the costs of you know, the time spent on the work locally, then you start to get something which is truly representative of the population. And being truly representative of the population, this is hard to reach groups. It's people who are poor, it's often ethnic minorities, it's often people who are adolescents or early 20s who sort of think politics is boring and, you know, all these old crinklies are not people I want to spend time with. You actually have to go and get these people and make it feel safe and interesting, and also that they're listened to in order that they get involved.
So this is a question, you mentioned, Peter, that about attracting new staff, I think, and also changing the culture to a can-do one. And if that's significant, do you think the informal nature of your meetings was an important example of that?
I do, absolutely, definitely. I think so many people are turned off, not just the public, but also potential staff, and others who interact with councils. So something very odd that happens when people get elected. We're all members of a relatively small community, and then suddenly I'm Councillor Macfadyen, and you have this whole, a different way of approaching me, and you have to sort of beg and stoop and grovel, and it was incredibly important to get rid of that, I think. And I mean, the only thing which happens, I guess, sometimes is that our staff or the council staff now go off and do things which aren't properly authorised or aren't, because they've taken the direction which we wanted them to, which is brilliant in some ways. And then otherwise you hear people going, I'm not sure we ever really agreed that. But, as long as it's in the budget and it's in the right direction, who's bothered? When I was brutally cut off by the Russians a moment ago, I think that's part of what you were talking about, is that being able to do things differently does change the different paradigms and different, that we have to change what there is, because it really, really doesn't work. Okay.
We were talking when you were off air about the panels that you have. And I'm just wondering, if you set up panels to consult and to come up with ideas, what happens if there's a conflict between your Flatpack councillors who've gone on as independents and the panels? I mean, if you have a participatory democracy versus a representative democracy, which one wins out if there's a conflict?
Well, one of the things that's interested me, and I've been most amazed by, Francis, is that people haven't abused this way of doing things. Again, Patrick was saying earlier that actually he doesn't believe that people are fed up with democracy, or people, that there is an apathy, which I absolutely share. I mean, our experience is that hundreds of people will come to meetings if they feel it's worth doing so and they're not insulted. And what we found in those panels was that people put forward things which were really doable. So, for instance, in the sports one, there were no requests for, I don't know, ice rinks and and things which couldn't be done. There was a really almost instant understanding of, okay, here's the deal. There's roughly this much money. We might be able to bring other money in from different funds. Here's the scope. Let's put forward things which are doable. People, it sounds condescending, but people were way more intelligent than we might expect. It's the same sort of thing if you've ever been to a town council meeting. You're only allowed a couple of minutes to speak at the beginning, usually. You're given a tiny little slot, and then you're told to shut up. Well, you're told that, your time is up, sit down. You let that go as long as you want. But nobody's abused that for 3 years. People understand that we've got business to do. So it hasn't arisen to be, is my answer. That, you know, and why would it? If all the people involved in sport are saying this is the way we go, why would it wouldn't be working if one councillor, or if 6, 7, 8 councillors were saying, no, that's nonsense. They're the experts.
Okay, Terry.
A question from Subot, who asks, how scalable is the model? And would it, for example, work in a town like Luton, which now has a population of over 215,000? And I think this question of scalability and informality seems to me to be quite important. And just when you were off air, Peter, I mentioned the fact that the sortition model that Patrick talked about in France is happening at a very different scale. So I just wonder how scalable your model is.
Well, my experience is not very, so it has been attempted in places like Winchester, in Cannon Valley in Wales, you know, and in other larger places. And Cannon Valley, they got one person in the place where the Labour Party was invented, you know, Labour hardcore forever. They got a lot of votes, but with first past the post, it's almost impossible to get enough if you're up against the parties, I think. The exception to that, I mean, I would have always said that until I met this alternative party in Denmark, but they have a different electoral system. So with a different, you know, a whole different way of doing things, you can get small, you know, parties in who are putting themselves forward as with a way of working or you know, a set of values rather than a manifesto. Personally, I don't think it is scalable, but that doesn't really bother me because I'm interested in working at this level. And you can introduce this level. So Queen's Park in London, for instance, have created a new parish council in London. So, you know, it is possible to recreate this level of democracy and then run it in this kind of way.
Peter asks, to what extent has new technology helped you? To what extent do you use new media, social networks in order to engage communities? I mean, like we're doing now, for example, but a lot more using some of the other platforms as well. Are you, in Ivan Ilish's sense, convivial in the sense you only meet face-to-face, or do you engage on social media as well?
Sure. We use a lot of, well, particularly Facebook and Twitter, I suppose. And one of the people who we appointed is a communications manager, because on the grounds that, again, you can't have participation without having constant, you know, without people having greater political literacy. And so we use it particularly to put things across in plain English. So there's a sort of loophole that you do have to have minutes and agendas in a fairly formal language, but the government hasn't caught up with social media. So you can have the formal agenda, but then you can publish a parallel one on Facebook that says, you know, come along tonight if you want to know about trees. You know, so you can, and equally at the end of the meeting, you can say, you know, we've decided to plant 1,000 trees. So you can do that in a way which is really helpful, I think, because, as I say, they haven't really caught up in that kind of a way. But that's the only way we really use it. And then we've done that in parallel. We have 9 community notice boards and a member of staff who goes around all of them first thing in the morning. So we're trying to do this with drawing pins and bits of paper as well as social media.
I mean, just to follow up on that, Kevin says, do you use it in your actual election campaigns? Because clearly political parties have an organisation and they have a budget, and you've got to get election addresses out of something, so you've got to pay your way. I mean, how do you pay your way, or do you use social media to do your electioneering?
Yep. We do, absolutely. And in that, I'm sure that was a main part of getting elected, that the other parties don't. I mean, they all have virtually no presence at all at this level. And we do a lot. And we crowdfunded. We gave ourselves, I can't remember now, 3 weeks to raise enough money to run the last campaign. And we'd done it by the end of the weekend. You know, there's a great, that was easy. So that's how we both fundraise for our campaign and then promote what we do.
Okay, Terry?
I just wanted to ask about 2 things you said earlier, Peter. At one stage, I think you said that some of the people in this independent group, if group is the right word, some people might be more right-wing, some people might be more left-wing. But you also said that you had agreed, I can't remember the exact words you used, but that you had agreed sort of common common values. And I wondered if you could just say something about how the common values work across people who, in terms of traditional politics, might be very different.
So traditional politics is essentially confrontational, and if one party says something, the other one's instinct is to oppose that. I think their initial instinct is nearly always to oppose it. And indeed, when we still had an opposition in the first time when we were elected, that's the role that the remaining party people took. They would oppose things even if it was completely obvious that they were good for Frome. And they said, we are the opposition, therefore we are opposing this bus stop for elderly people, even though they want it, which struck us as rather mad, but there we are. So what was the first part of that question? I've lost my train of thought.
Yes, it was really about the potential conflict between having a shared set of values and having different political small p views.
Yeah, no, thank you. So what those set of values are is, for me, they're common sense. They're things. The main one I would say is not holding grudges. So that if you lose a vote, you don't then oppose something later on principle, if you see what I mean. So what would normally happen is that if Francis had put forward his great idea and I had successfully opposed it and he'd been shot down, he'd make jolly sure that come the next vote, he would oppose me, whatever that vote was. And you ended up in this constant, separation and confrontation. And so one of the things that we say is that, you shouldn't do that. And to my surprise, we're here 7 and a bit years later. That has worked and because everyone can see that it makes sense. And so essentially they're a set of suggestions really about the way that we behave together. More about listening than talking, making sure that you're prepared to change your mind, entering meetings, prepared to change your mind, all these things which are a complete anathema to politicians, to traditional politicians, but I think are what we do in everyday life. And that's part of what's attractive about the model.
Yeah, Peter Burden says, he comes from Lewis, and he says they have a lot of groups and societies there, a lot of bonfire societies, because Lewis has some great bonfire activities, don't they? And community-owned football clubs and so on. And they work with them. I mean, do you have equivalent groups like that in Frome? Do you work with them? And I suppose that goes to another question I was going to ask. I mean, measuring your success really is seen, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. Do you get more participation by working with these groups? And have you measured that the participation has gone up in Frome compared to what it was before? And indeed, has the turnout at elections gone up because you now are doing things in a different way?
Yes, to all of those. I mean, that's my answer. So yes, we there's definitely far more engagement in local organisations and local societies, and we've been part of enabling that to happen. There are other things which I didn't mention before. We run a sort of central clearinghouse for volunteers. So local organisations who want volunteers, or people who want to volunteer, can swap, find themselves through that. So there are lots of things that we do, as well as money and fundraising advice, to promote the local community, which is definitely more vibrant than others around. And that's a key part to what we do, and that has worked. That first election, we're about 75% more people voted. It's difficult to know because we have a ward system, which means that, well, you can't just count the number of people who vote, unfortunately. So it's slightly difficult to know. But certainly in the most recent election, with, as I said before, 40 different people standing against us, there was a real buzz. And we've just had a by-election a year before an election. Who'd bother to compete that? Well, all the major parties competed in that election, and pleasingly, Independents of Frome won it with more than half of the votes. But so in one sense, complete waste of time. But there is a real desire to get onto Frome's town council, whereas 2/3 of where am I? 2/3 of town councils in Britain don't have enough people to stand on them.
And I wonder whether we could be working towards a sort of new democratic model where at the local small scale level, it's done on this informal independent basis, and at the large scale level, it's done on a much more anonymous sortition basis. And I wonder whether those two could exist side by side, and I'd be interested to hear, what each of you thought about that.
Okay, should we go with you first, Patrick?
Obviously, I really like Peter, and I think you can tell he's a fundamentally decent guy from what he says, and the way he says it, and the way he speaks. And I'm sure the same is true for the other people in Frome Town Council. I think it needs to be more robust than that. So even at the level of Frome, what I think, and I hark back to the ancient Greeks, is that random selection and deliberation is more robust fundamentally than elections, which the Greeks talked about for city-states as inevitably moving towards aristocracy or oligarchy. So I think what's wonderful about Frome is that there have been real tangible results, and they got power away from traditional parties. My concern going forward would be that the tall poppies would get drawn to become members of the town council, and they would not necessarily retain the values that Peter and his colleagues have shown quite clearly. So I still think that random selection and deliberation is where we would be ideally going at every level. Okay,
but Peter, the question from Terry was, could you scale what you do up? Is that a possibility?
Well, the scaling up is no, I don't think it is a possibility. In many ways, I think it has to be done at this level, and I think Patrick's right as well. Incidentally, I would love to see us, I would love to see a town council like Frome's grasp sortition, because he's absolutely right. There's a real risk of us. Or of independence for Frome narrowing in. One of the things we're doing, I won't stand again next year because I think it's really important to bring new people in, and most of us won't. And so there will be an opportunity to bring people in, and we will be looking as widely as possible to bring people in. But we are still using a model which I started off by saying I think is dysfunctional in some ways as an electoral system. So I'd love to see us using sortition to make particular decisions initially. And then, ideally one would roll it out to a much greater, or many more of the decisions that are made at a town council level.
Okay, and finally, Peter, I mean, you mentioned that your book has sold 4,500 copies. A lot of other people are looking at it. Has your experiment been replicated anywhere, or are you a unique case? Is there something in the air in Somerset where Frome and places like Stroud, who's also done experimental things, do all of these things, or is it possible elsewhere, and has it happened?
Yes, it's possible elsewhere, and yes, it has happened elsewhere. There's about a dozen places, two of which are up in Durham, one of which I'd never heard of, who simply, got in touch after the May elections last year, and I got a little picture of them in a pub, all with their glasses raised, saying, thanks very much, bought your book, 9 out of 9 councillors. The Haswells community, overseeing the mayor who'd been there for years, who was also the county council mayor, so there are little pockets of revolution happening all over the country.
There's one final question. I'll put it because it's quite important, I guess, and then we'll finish and we'll conclude. But Peter said, to what extent, how representative is the group of independents in terms of gender, ethnicity, and so on? I mean, are you concerned with that, or do you just take what comes?
We're very concerned with it. So the group. So at the moment we're half men, half women. We're half people who were born in Frome and half who have come to live in Frome, because there's a real dichotomy and quite a lot of issues around that. I wish it were otherwise, but being representative in Frome in terms of ethnicity means basically being white. I mean, we're in rural England. There are relatively few people of minorities here. The exceptions being a Polish community who would be brilliant to bring in at some point, and one would love to do, but that hasn't happened yet. I think we're as representative as we can get, and way more representative in age, gender, and where we come from than nearly every other council in the country.
Anyhow, I mean, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Patrick, for doing this. It's again one of our many webinars and activities and events where we are looking at different forms of democracy and how we can make what we do better and involve more people and change the system for the better. And you'd helped us to do that in a great way. And you're doing some great things, I know, both of you, and what you've done in Frome is really, really innovative. And I think an example of how people can do things in a similar way, not necessarily the same, in a similar way elsewhere. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for Terry for helping out on the questions, and thank you all in the audience for the questions and the comments you've given. And I think we've had a really good session, which I hope we'll do again and follow this up. So thank you all.